Problem, Mike. Just go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get it to work.
Yep,
Um,
yep. Good luck.
okay, it says it's recorded. Okay, so what I was looking for information to use this evening, and so I collected some stuff. I'd like you to look at this picture here. So this particular stack of books, I've only not read one of them, and it's the one that says America's Soaring Book, and I just got that one because. And up at the top well, several of these books are ones that I would really recommend that you try to go and locate. Get that out of the way. So here are the two books by George Moffett, Winning and Winning 2, Winning on the Wind and Winning 2 up here at the top. The one underneath it is Understanding the Sky by Dennis Pagan. Now, it's not in print. You have to look for it on Amazon, but it is a wonderful discussion of the atmospheric phenomenon that we call weather and that sort of thing. If you have not read it, see if you can locate a copy. I mentioned in several other situations that there were a series of seminars that were produced between 1969 and 1972. This book down here, Soaring Cross Country, is for the most part a compilation of that information put into a book, along with a lot of it also showed up in this Advanced Soaring that was edited by John Joss. Now this is the other stack. And again, except for the fundamentals of sailplane design, which I've read some of, and the fluid dynamic drag, which I've also read some of, but some of it's a little bit beyond me. Most of the rest of these I've read. And the only reason to point this all out to you is what I've been trying to do in these various seminars is to try to consolidate into as succinct as possible presentation of the information here, because you can see there's a lot of reading to do. Besides VTech, anybody know what's over here on the right-hand side?
Sure do.
Paragraph.
Paragraph.
A barograph. Yeah, that one's an old winter barograph that I've had for quite a while. And I thought I'd gotten rid of it. And when I was digging out some of the books, I found it sitting on the shelf, and I thought, oh, great. Yeah, make a great book stop. So that's what I've done with this. Okay. Well, enough of that. Let's go ahead and get started here. Our agenda tonight is to talk first of all about thermal sintering and how that's done. And hopefully I've got some good and bad examples to show you. We're going to talk about some of the things that happen when you're flying into and out of a thermal, which I've discovered that very few people actually have considered, and we're going to look at it. There's been a great series of questions I've received, and I'm sure some of you have some questions on MacCready and what is it and why is it and everything else. Again, I'm going to try to consolidate and simplify a bunch of things, but this is probably where we're going to spend most of our time tonight, I hope, because I believe that will be at least as useful as anything else that we might be doing. Okay, so a couple of things to think about. There are lots of different techniques, and I'm going to have some graphics here for you in just a minute, for getting into a thermal, and once you're there, not getting into it, but once you're there, figuring out how to center that thermal. Now we're going to see some idealistic discussions of thermal centering. The real world is not that perfect. And a couple of things that are can create issues as we're working with this has to do with the time it takes for us to make a circle. And that's based on speed, bank angle, and the fact that our varios, even the very best ones that we can buy today, have some degree of lag. Now, we talked about varios last week, and we talked about the fact that most of the very modern varios, in addition to having a pressure sensor, also have a G meter, or I should say a accelerometer and a gyroscope. And because of that, they can detect things that couldn't be detected with a standard mechanical vario, because they can tell that the aircraft is changing direction even without, even before an indication or a pressure change might take place. Okay, let's see. Where did that go? Oh, yeah. I am going to close that for the moment. Where are the rest of the pictures? This is not good. Stand by. I hope I haven't lost them after all that time. Well, folks, I won't even tell you how frustrating this is. There were 30 slides, and I have 9 of them here. Maybe I can reclaim it.
Mark, just take your time and find the slides.
Well, the fact of the matter is that, oh, how come I've got 2 copies of it? Let's see if that's the difference. Okay. There we go. All right, so you all see the agenda still? Anybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So one of the things we talked about last week was that climbing is more important than flying fast. And one of the first things that we want to think about is centering the thermal. How long does that take us? So this is from John Cochran's article, Just a Little Faster, Please, number 2. And what we have here is a table, and the numbers in the table indicate the achieved rate of climb, considering that it may take you as much as 2 minutes to center a thermal. Now I'm going to pause there for a moment. One of the things I mentioned before was the time it takes to make a circle. Most of the time in a thermaling circle, it's going to take you somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds to make a turn. So 2 minutes represents 4 to 6 circles to center a thermal. Now that may be a little bit excessive. I think that with practice you can get quite a bit faster than that. But the point is that the cost of the circle of the centering is important to the actual achieved rate of climb. So we talked last week about the real rate of climb, not what we see on our vario when we hit the strongest surge, or necessarily what we see on average on the vario, but rather what is it that we've actually gained for the length of time that we've been flying. So one of the things about thermal centering and things that get in our way, number one, as I said before, the world is not perfect, which means thermals are not necessarily round. But the other thing that happens is if we're bombing along at 80 or 90 knots, and we're going to see why that might be a good thing to do, the time it takes for you to decelerate may place the thermal quite a ways behind you. And how do I mean quite a ways? 300 or 400 feet behind you, maybe more. And if you study some of the other articles, and I didn't bring any of them in here, a circle on the average at 51 knots, 55 knots, somewhere in there, a circle is going to be around 600 to maybe 700 feet across. And if you're bombing along at 60 knots, that's about 10 seconds across the thermal. So if you are slow or hesitant to slow down, you may be very well 200 or 300 feet, 400 feet beyond the thermal when you make your turn. One of the other challenges is that your turn itself may not be a circle. If your bank and speed are changing, you're not making a circle. And that results in making it difficult to map the thermal. Now, one of the things about mapping a thermal, it requires a degree of positional, spatial capability. As you're making the turn and turning in a thermal, you need to be keeping aware of where you are in that thermal and where the lift was. Was it behind you on the right, on the left, how far back? Sometimes you can do that intuitively. Excuse me, sometimes it's harder. And if you don't know where the center of the thermal is based on the turns you've been making, it's tough to move the circle like we're going to talk about for centering. Varios lag, except for some of the very, very modern ones where the lag is incredibly short. And they can still lag because the pedostatic system, or the static system in this case, or the TE system, that tube is very long, and the pressure changes in that tube may in fact happen slower because the tube is very long, and that can affect how quickly the vario reacts. And it's going to be different for every installation. So one of the things that you need to learn is for the particular aircraft or aircraft that you're going, multiple aircraft that you're going to fly, is to experiment and figure out what kind of a lag do you think this particular system is giving you. And it's a time lag, but because you're moving at a particular speed, it's also a distance lag. So those are, there's no way for someone else to tell you what it is on a particular aircraft. So you're just going to have to go out and experiment. Different thermal strengths and different thermal sizes, of course, exist. And the optimal circle diameter for a given thermal may be larger or smaller than what you're accustomed to flying. And so you're going to have to modify your speed and your bank angle in order to adapt to what gives you the best rate of climb in that thermal. These are things that come from practice, and there's not much more that can be said about that, except that with practice, you will be able to center and you will be able to shift your thermal circle into different places. Okay, so what we have here, this is from the glider flying handbook from the FAA. And the first one is called the 270 correction. So you come in and you turn around and you fly, after you've made a 270-degree circle, you turn and then you fly straight for a while, and then you start a turn of the same size again. And over time, you can find the center. But I want you to look at that straight line that connects the two semicircles that we've got there. What do you have to do to fly that straight line? Your wings have to be level. If your wings aren't level, then you make a bit of a curved path like we see on the right-hand picture, because you're not rolled out completely. And this becomes a problem, because if you only roll out partially, then you're making a curved path that is unpredictable. If you can roll out rapidly, hold level, count to 3 and roll back in, you're probably going to move close to 300 feet. 60 miles an hour or 60 knots every second is 100 feet. Now this is not you're not going to be flying at that. You're going to be flying, let's say, at 40. Well, that means it's about 75 feet. You can work the numbers out for yourself. But the point is that if you're going to move a circle, number one, you want to move it in a predictable fashion, which means you have to be able to roll out. And you have to be able to have an idea in your mind about how far you want to try to move it. So what I have found in this particular case is that if you roll out sharply, you got to get your rudders working, fly straight for about 3 seconds and roll in again, oftentimes that works out reasonably well. That 3 seconds is about a quarter of the diameter of a standard thermal. Remember, well, what I said was about 1,000 feet is a standard thermal based on what people have said in the past, but you don't always get one that big. Okay, now look at the red circle. It's the same size circle, but what happened was we were decelerating as we pulled up into that circle, and it displaced us. And now the circle that we're in has almost no lift at all. And so we don't really have any idea of which way to move the circle necessarily. Now, I got to tell you, that this is oftentimes what I've run into, is that I'm going fast and then I pull up and I bank over a little too soon or a little too late actually, and end up having to come back at about 235 degrees to go back into the lift air mass that was lifting at that point. The other thing is, if you crank over at the high speed and try to slow down in the circle, that just means you have a constantly changing radius, which means that it's difficult again to figure out where you need to go next. So again, the whole idea here is in the thermal centering. Number one, you've got to make nice round circles. Now, that's not to say that thermals are round, but making nice round circles is the first step to figuring out where you're going to go. On the right-hand side, we have what's called the wing, opposite the wing low or the wing high, whichever you want to call it. As this sailplane is turning, it notes that one wing is being lifted, and that wing is, or the strongest lift is so that we're being lifted. And that means that the direction of that side of the glider is where we want to go. And so one thing we can do is take a sight off of something in the distance over on that side, just as we go through the surge. And then as we come around the turn, we're going to roll out and fly in that direction towards that point that we've determined. It could be a point on the horizon. In this particular case, they're showing you a lake. Now the lake would be below you. You look at this picture and you say, oh gosh, the cloud, I'm above the cloud. A little bit, I think this is a little bit, the drawing makes me think about the cloud, but that's not the cloud, that's the lift. And so while we're in the turn, we should be able to look out under and below us and see an object or a reference point that we can turn towards. Okay, so let's look at a couple of other techniques. On the number one that's on the lower left corner, you come in, or you've determined a circle. This is the dark circle, and the dashed circle is what we're going to try to do. And as we turn in towards the stronger lift, we shallow out the bank. Now, this is not the same as flying in a straight line that we talked about. This is simply shallowing out the bank. How much is a good question, but there's no specific answer. Typically what they say is you shallow it out, and as you feel or as you hear the lift beginning to diminish, you then steepen back in the bank. So this is the shallow while in lift and steepen as the lift drops off. And this one tends to be, it tends to be one that you can use. What happens, or what I find happening with many people that I've worked with, is that it's a lot, again, the vario lag can make it so that you roll out and then you feel it or you hear it. It may be a little bit late telling you that you're moving out of the lift, and then you make a turn and you're not really centered up. In number 2, what they're doing is using a time and or a heading change. So what this is saying is the lowest point was behind me, and I didn't, but it's being indicated to me now because I have a lag in my vario. And so I'm not gonna turn 180 degrees or 90 degrees, I'm sorry, like I might think I should. I'm gonna roll out at 60. Now, actually, I've read a couple of books that basically say when you hear the lowest lift, look in the direction you want to turn to the 45 and roll out on that point and fly for a few seconds and roll back in. And that seems to work pretty well for a lot of people. Now, one of the things, I show a little oblong thing here, and what that is if you've determined a circle and then you change the speed, or you shallow the bank a little when you don't need, when you didn't mean to, you end up doing what I call scalloping out of the circle. And that is that you are not making a circle. And what that can do is give you a false indication that either the lift is dying or that you need to shift the circle, when in fact, it wasn't a circle. So it's really important to think about that. The last one down there is, again, vario lag. You felt the surge of lift there. It didn't show up on your, well, let's see, you felt the surge of lift. You went ahead and rolled it out, and then you counted to 3 and you rolled back in, and you actually ended up displacing yourself again. Now, what I'm going to do here, any questions before we move on there? Because there may be a few questions that someone has. No questions. Okay.
Do you really count to 3 or to 5?
Okay, VTech, in the background, there's a very hard buzz on your machine. I'm not sure what it is, and I didn't understand the question. Can you try again, please?
Do you really turn after 3 seconds or 5 seconds?
Are you talking about the initial turn, or are you talking about the recentering turn?
The recentering.
Well, I guess what I do is I say, how far do I want to try moving this circle? And again, knowing that I'm going to be able to shift it about at 45 knots, I'm going to shift it at about 75 feet per second. I may take only 3 seconds. That's about, that's going to be, what does that work out? 225, a 225 shift, which may not be enough, but that's, some number, whether it be 3 or 5. I think 5 oftentimes might be too far if you're pretty close to the center already. So I usually start with 3, and then if I need to move it again, I'll use another 2 or 3. Other questions?
That sounds good.
Okay. All right, here we go. So,
I have a quick question before we go on.
yes,
Are you basing this on audio cues or actual display of the Vario?
well, we talked last week about the fact that if we don't have an audio Vario, our life is going to be very tough because we're going to be looking inside all the time. And that, among other things, that tends to make the the positional awareness to be somewhat less than, I find that when I'm looking away, I end up not being able to keep track of where I am. Excuse me, if I'm looking inside, I'm not able to keep track of where I am in the space. And so I tend to use just the audio. I mean, the audio should be there and it should be giving you an indication of the strength of the lift. So I guess the answer is I'm using the audio.
So I assume from that the time constant of the audio is the same as the actual needle time constant? Or is there a way to even separate those?
So I guess it depends on the instrumentation that you're using. I mean, I've been using LX-Nav Varios for quite a while now, and I have not seen a significant difference between what I'm hearing on the audio and what I'm seeing on a needle. In other words, the audio is tracking the needle very well.
Well, you guys are talking about basically flying IFR. What I've experienced is what is called flying by the seat of the pants, is to follow the feeling of the acceleration to your butt. And when you feel the initial push up, then you count to 3, then you roll it.
Yeah. So interesting, VTech's talking about, you've got all of these different instruments. We have a gentleman in the Willamette Valley Club that went up one day and discovered that his Vario wasn't working. And he ended up having about a 2.5-hour flight. And he came back down and he said, it's really interesting flying without an audio Vario. You actually can feel the thermals. And that's basically what VTech is saying. You can feel some of that acceleration. And that helps you, if you're paying attention to it, that helps you to feel some of that. Again, the instrument may be lagging to some degree, but your acceleration probably won't. Okay, let me share something with you here. All right, this is CU, one of my favorite tools to use to improve myself. And I'm going to be coming into a thermal here, I think. Let's see what happens when I start this up. Oh, come on. There we go. That looks like the landing. That's not what I wanted. Just a second. This is the Alvord Desert in southwestern or southeastern Oregon. And we launch with automobile, and that's what this was here, one of those. It's a wonderful place to fly. It's a lousy place to visit. And I only say that because it's just full of dust. Okay, this is a good example. I'm going to come into the thermal. It was not a particularly good thermal. You can see that I'm not that high above the ground. You can see the figure eights I was making to get enough altitude to go out and see if I could find something else. Okay, so let's watch this. So there's the turn and turn 2 and turn 3. Now I'm going to stop right there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look right down on top of my own circles. Now those circles, if you look over here in the right-hand corner, I'm sorry, the left-hand corner, you can see the windsock. So those circles are almost right on top of each other. The other thing we can see is that the west side, that's the side, let me get my spotlight. The side over here, this is not as strong as what we see here because this is a deeper color of orange. Looking on the right-hand side, you can see that pale yellow is fairly weak and bright red is fairly strong. And blue is sinking or not climbing. Also realize that this is not the vario. This is the altitude change that's being recorded in the IGC logger. So it doesn't know what the vario is saying. It's only showing what your rate of climb is in this particular thermal. Okay, one more turn. I'm saying, okay, I've got to do something. This isn't quite what I wanted. Let's see if I can move around and find it. Not all that great. Okay, now I'm going to pause it again. So I found a little bit better line. You see the line I was on there. Here's the center of my circles. And now I've got my circles right here. Could have been a wind shift. In fact, you'll see over here that the windsock is showing that a wind shift occurred as I came up a little higher. Down here, it says I had a 3.2 knot thermal. Now that is, we've talked about real rate of climb. That's real rate of climb because that's CU measuring from when I started the circling until I stopped the circling. So that's the real rate of climb. That's not what my vario showed. Now, once I got it kind of stable, looks like I've decided to leave. Okay. So that's one I wanted to show you is just the, you can be shifting it around to try to find it. But in general, once you think you've centered it, your circles should sit right on top of each other or pretty close to it. Now, when I do these analysis with people, most of these areas that are blue turn out to be areas where someone went faster. And that kind of pushed you off to the side or gave you some sink there. Okay, so this is another one. This is another individual. And we're going to watch their flight here for a moment. So they pulled up. We're going to pause it. We're going to look down the circles. And what you see is there was a pull up, then a dive, and then they tightened the turn up, and there was some gain. Maybe they dive, they pulled up from the gain, pulled up from the increase in speed. Again, this is telling us that there was a climb. It doesn't tell us how the climb was achieved. Then we have another turn, and we can see that following this turn, the circle got larger. And following the next turn, the circle got larger again. And we can see some light blue over here, indicating probably that either an increase in speed or maybe some shallowing of the bank occurred. Now, what I want you to see from this is you can see that to this side of the thermal, right here, we're not getting a lot of lift. Now, that could be because as they come around, they're dropping the nose. I see that happening a lot too. If the speed is not constant, even if you hold the bank, the circle's going to move when you didn't intend it to move. About there, they decide, no, I'm done. Going to try one more time. So now when you think about a couple of the articles that I've mentioned before, one of the ones from John Cochran, and I'm sending you four different articles with the email that I'll send out tonight. But these last three turns, actually from right about here, we had 1 turn, 2 turns, 3 turns. How long is that? It's about 1.5 minutes probably, maybe a little more. So that was 1.5 minutes removed from the actual climb rate. Down here it says that the average for the thermal was 1.2 knots. They stayed in the thermal for 5 minutes and only gained 705 feet. Now, if you look from the side view here, it looks like you can see this kind of diving action here, Again, if you're not holding the speed, it could be that you're diving away in this particular case, or it could be that the thermal core is right here where I'm drawing the line, and the downdraft starts right in here where that part of the circle is going. Okay. Any questions on these two examples before I move on? By the way, CU is really a wonderful, wonderful tool to be able to analyze what the potential of what you're doing. You can't always tell everything, but you can tell a lot just by looking at the climb and everything else. One of the things I didn't show you was, the glider I was flying in that particular case was a mini Nimbus. It has a theoretical maximum L over D of 42 to 1. I think it might be closer to 40 to 1 on the one that I've had. But if you look at some of the traces there, it's indicating 65 or 75 to 1. And that's because, going back to what we talked about several weeks ago, that's finding the lift line and staying in the lift line so that you can extend the glide and not circle. Circling never gets you moving forward. I mean, unless the wind is helping you, but it doesn't help you as much as not circling. So you want to strive to circle as little as possible, which means that you need to circle as efficiently as possible. And the first step in circling efficiently is to make sure that you can center the thermal quickly. Okay, a couple of things that people don't necessarily think about much. When we're flying into and out of a thermal, there are some changes in angle of attack that, if we don't react to them, can give us some problems. So we're going to look at them. Another thing that happens is, while it's not a really large significant amount, thermals usually, especially if they're making clouds, have a higher degree of humidity than the air mass that they're flying through. So their density goes down, and that also reduces the performance. Now, you got to read some other books to understand why the density of the air is less as the humidity goes up, but it's nevertheless true. And it took me a while to think about it. I think most people go, oh, well, if there's water in the air, water's heavier than air. Well, water droplets are, but water vapor is not. Okay, the other thing to think about is we have attitude changes that take place as we're circling. And usually an attitude change gives us a change in our airspeed and our sink rate. But as we enter and leave a thermal, we can easily be fooled. And we're going to look at that in the next picture. We have this concept called sight picture. When we roll into a thermal and we look through the canopy or past the yaw string or whatever and position it on the horizon, that position on the horizon, if we hold it, should hold our speed fairly close. One of the biggest problems that beginners end up with is that they They don't look out there. They roll in, they glance down at the airspeed indicator, and the airspeed indicator is starting to slow down and they want to speed up. So they relax some of the pressure on the stick, and then the airspeed, nothing's happening. And then it starts to speed up and they end up chasing the needle. Just look outside, get the sight picture, and try to hold that speed. That's what you need to do. One of the things that happens, and we're going to see the reason why in just a moment, is that as we enter a thermal, we actually start flying slower for the same attitude. And we also get closer to the stall, even though we haven't pulled the nose up, given that we're holding the same speed. You'll see that in a second. And when we're exiting, we have an increased descent rate for the same attitude. And again, we're going to see why that is. So I want you to look at these two diagrams. The black line in both cases is exactly identical. And that black line represents our relative wind, which you hopefully have learned about in your basic training. And in the case of a glider, the relative wind at a given speed is constant. However, that assumes that the air mass is also constant, either in a descent or in a climb, not suddenly changing. So if we look at the upper picture, the green vertical arrow represents the vertical speed of the thermal, and the long green arrow represents the change that occurs in our relative wind because of that added vertical component. Now, these are called vector diagrams. I hope you're familiar enough with them that they're not confusing, but you can see very clearly that between the black arrow and the large green arrow, the angle of attack on the wing has increased. Now, what does that do? Well, that increases our lift and it increases our drag, because every time our lift increases, our drag increases and we start to slow down. This is what happens when we begin to enter the thermal. And if we went straight through the middle of a thermal, our glider would want to pitch up first, and then because we have set it for a trim speed, it's going to nose down and hold the same speed. So the attitude, as we're looking at it, will be slightly nose down from just before we entered the thermal. This also means that if you rapidly pull up, you may actually get a stall before you expect it. And the stronger the thermal, the more pronounced this is. So one of the things to remember is as you go up, you're going to want to push the nose down, perhaps slightly lower than it was when you would normally be flying that speed. And until you've gotten the speed stable, don't change the attitude, especially don't pull up too briskly. A similar thing is happening as we leave a thermal, because the outside of the thermal is descending air. And if we look at the lower picture, we see the red vertical, which represents the descending air. And we see that the resulting relative wind is now a lower angle of attack. By definition, a lower angle of attack means we get less lift at the same airspeed. And if we get less lift, what's the plane going to do? It's going to try to regain its trim speed, and it's going to descend it's going to be pretty hard to accelerate this glider because it's not creating the lift that you need. So as we enter a thermal, we may get a pronounced pitch up, we may not, we definitely will get a higher angle of attack. And as we leave a thermal, we're going to likely have a tough time decelerating. If we just peeled off the edge of a turn and tried to fly out of the thermal, you'd be really surprised at how far you've got to put the nose down to get it to actually accelerate. And part of that's descending air is not helping you. Okay, any questions on this before we move on? If you read in some of the discussions, especially George Moffett was always very fond of saying that when he was ready to leave a thermal, he would tighten his turn up so he could fly right through the center of the thermal as he accelerated. And that way, when he got out the side of the lift zone, he's already moving pretty quick, and that reduces the length of time that he's in the sink. Now, when we're flying in a gaggle with a bunch of other people, that's probably not a good thing to do, but it does work. Bill, did you have something to say? Mr. Boyd? Okay. All right, I am not getting the chat here. Am I missing some chat from you guys? Let me see if I can get it here.
You're doing a great job there, Mike.
Okay, I'm just trying to make sure that I can respond to everybody if I need to. That's all I'm looking for here. You guys are all so quiet. Next week you can't be quiet. And the reason is, you see no chats. Up in your in the lower portion of your screen, there should be a button that says chats, and you can click on that, and it will open up a side window. And then if you click on the bottom portion of it, you can send a message to everyone, or you can send a message just to me by picking from the to button. It says to everyone, or to specifically any of the individuals. Okay, I've got my chat up and running, so I should be able to see what's going on now. Okay, if there aren't any other comments or questions on this particular one, we're going to go into the famous MacCready numbers.
I do have a quick comment here.
Yes, Mark.
So basically what you're saying, if I come screaming into a thermal at 90 or 100 knots and pull a vertical line, and then as my speed drops off at the top of my vertical line, I do a wing over to establish my circle, that's not a good idea?
Well, so here's a couple of problems with that. But if you make that a standard habit and you want to go fly with some other people, you're going to scare someone into a problem in their glider.
I said this half joking, of course, but I have seen that happen.
Oh, I know. Some people are much too aggressive. But the other problem, and we talked about total energy last week, and when you do a hard, more than a 1.4 or 1.5 pull-up, you actually are removing energy from your system, from the system of the glider, because you're increasing the drag. And if you watched your total energy, it would show an indication of down. So the first problem is a hard pull-up is not normally a good idea, and a pull-up into a crowd is never a good idea. But if you're flying by yourself and you're fairly confident that you are, you can go ahead and try that. Now, one of the things, I mentioned before that in my particular case, I used to find that when I pulled up, if I pulled up, I went too far, and by the time I rolled into the turn, I was offset from the thermal. Unless you can pull up right in the middle of the circle and then tip over at the top and roll at the same time and get pretty close to the middle of the circle, that maneuver is not necessarily going to give you a better chance to center the thermal. Okay?
Sounds great. Another question while we're still talking about thermals and centering.
Go ahead.
Flap adjustment. Obviously, you're pulling more G's than normal. You're flying pretty slow. What's the typical flap setting recommended?
Well, the flaps are based upon the airspeed. The flaps should be changed as the airspeed changes.
I realize that, but you're talking a whole bunch of different G forces when you're in a corner. Does that change anything, or do you still use the same recommendation?
Usually, if you do what you said you're doing, that's going to happen so quickly that you're not going to hit the right numbers anyway. So I would just pull it up. And I tend to go towards the cambering as soon as I'm fairly confident that I'm going to stay in this thermal. One of the challenges is that if you pull the flaps too soon and then decide that you don't want to stay there, it's a lot harder to get accelerated again. And it depends on the aircraft, but that's what I found. Several years ago, I got a chance to fly an ASW-20, and it's a beautiful airplane, wonderful to fly. Charlie, are you here? Not tonight. Charlie Longley just got himself one. But in it, and this is true in my Mini also, you don't change airspeeds by pitch and trim. You change airspeeds by flaps. So as I come into an area where I'm beginning to feel some lift, I'll move my flaps towards a cambered position. But as soon as, unless I see a reason to stop, it's going to go right back down again so I can keep moving without, because the flaps being down is going to limit my acceleration. As you're going through, let me explain a technique. We're talking about thermaling, and thermaling means stopping. What do you do if you're coming into some lift and you don't want to stop? And we're going to talk later about why you might not want to stop. And what I typically do is I pull into the lift, I slow down, pull in my flaps, and then I start making shallow turns to stay in the lift without losing too much of my forward motion until I'm ready to get moving again. And I just pull the flap back to where it was and lower the nose and off I go. And if you look at some of the traces, you're welcome to go up on OLC and look at some of the traces. How is it that a 40-to-1 glider is getting 68 or 69-to-1 L over D on some of its inner thermal runs? And the answer is you take advantage of every scrap of lift to prevent stopping and circling. And that's what you're looking to do.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So my basic question was, say you're established in the thermal, you've been there for 3, 4, 5 minutes, you're not hunting, you're not centering, you're just in the thermal. There must be some optimum speed and flap setting for, say, a glider that gets a 0 and a negative, and also maybe a 5 and a 10-degree setting, and then also a landing setting. Obviously, you're not going to be in the landing setting, but you have a choice between 0, 5, or 10 degrees down flaps. How do you know to use the 5 or the 10?
So there's not a pat answer. And the reason is, what is 5 or 10? For example, in my LaBelle, when I owned it, it's a H301, it thermaled best at about 6.5 degrees down. If I pulled the full 8 degrees in, I could hear the air shredding at the junction of the flaps. So it was never, ever a good idea to do that. If I needed to have better control of the airframe, less flaps are usually a better idea. And if I was in a very turbulent thermal, I might use less flaps. What I'm saying is there's no pat answer. And it's going to vary from type of glider to type of glider.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep. Sorry, I can't give you a better answer than that. But most of the time, by the way, your flight manual, pilot handbook, should give you some suggestions about the range of flaps that you should be using in different cases.
Mike, in my opinion, it is very important which flap setting you set at the time that you're entering the thermal. You're obviously on a cruising flap when I hit the thermal. So what I do is I immediately change it from the cruising to thermal flap setting. And then conversely, when at your diagram and then notes, when you decide to exit, then it's up to your experience at what point to transition from your thermal flap setting to cruise setting.
Yes, thank you.
would it be correct to say that you actually don't control the speed with your flaps? You control the speed with the pitch, and then you just tune the flaps towards the speed.
Well, you know, it really depends on the aircraft. Like I said, the Mini Nimbus specifically in the handbook says primarily change speed with flaps. Now that's the cruise speed, but you know, you put in the 7-degree flap for thermaling, and like the tech, as soon as I've decided I'm going to pull up into a thermal, I'm going to move from a cruise setting towards a thermal setting. Am I going to use the most rearward, the steepest angle? Maybe not to start with. Now in the Mini, and I can use that just as an example right now, it only had one setting. It was either 0 or negative, or it was +7. And so that was my only choice. Again, it's going to vary in your aircraft, and you really need to think about, look at, read. Most of the time you can create a little ring that goes around your airspeed indicator with the ranges that each flap setting should be used in. And by using, you know, as the needle moves through one of the markers, you change the flap setting. Now, the question that you ask, Alex, is, do we change airspeed with pitch? The answer is yes, but we can also, in some cases, change the airspeed, not just only with pitch, but with flap settings also. We may need to slow down while in a particular flap range, and that's most likely going to be done with elevator control. There's no other place to put the flaps. I mean, the flap, you know, flap 1 is in this range, so anywhere in that range that you want to change the speed, you're going to have to use the elevator.
So as W20 manual says that flap settings depend on airspeed and also wing loading.
Yeah.
Right, which in its own turn depends on the G's.
So,
and let's say when you're pulling the stick up, right? So in order to slow down, you also increase the G's a little bit. So even though you may be flying slower until you hold this G's till 1G, or then you still kind of staying in the less flaps. When you slow down, remove the G's, then you put the flaps on.
So,
right, not the reverse.
So the answer is the G load does not increase, it's not a long time. It's a very quick thing. So you're not going to be in 2Gs, 2G pull up for a long period of time. So let's go back to your comment regarding wing loading. There is a specialized ring that you can put on your airspeed indicator. I call it VTech, you'll know what it's called. I think it's called a gross wing or a gross ring or something like that. And so you change the ring based on the wing loading. And so that's actually, you're right, you do want to change the flap ranges based on wing loading. But number one, you have to know what it is. And number two, you have to have one of these rings, or you've got to have a modern Vario that tells you when to change flaps based by the loading. And so when you start to fly, you say, I have this loading today. And it says, okay, then flap 1 goes, you need to make that switch here. Again, a little bit beyond from what we're trying to talk about today. But I agree that you do need to be aware of when to change the flaps, and the fact that loading of the airframe is going to change when the flaps need to be switched.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
This is Mark Stanfield. Hey, so you were saying something about the air shredding behind you.
Yeah.
In which setting were you noticing that?
Well, so this was my old LaBelle. It's an H301, and it had cambering all the way up, I think, as much as 10 degrees, but I never used it past 8 degrees, because when I was in the thermal and I tried to pull it past 8 degrees, I could hear the change in the turbulence along the side of the fuselage as the air mass was not, or the airflow was being turbulated really bad. So that's what I mean by shredding.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, when I'm doing certain high speeds in negative flaps, I can get sometimes a screaming sound, and I kind of
That's probably part of a seal of some kind that you need to improve on. Either a seal between the flap surface or the flap surface in the side of the fuselage. There is I recommend a article by Will Schumann back in 1971 or 72, when he talked about how he improved or reduced the drag and improved the performance of an H301 LaBelle, as a matter of fact.
yeah.
And what he did to improve it, among other things, was to figure out where the turbulences were occurring and do everything he could to remove them.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, let's move on to MacCready. Where are we? Ooh, already an hour. So Paul MacCready was a pretty interesting man. Many of you may know of his achievements, but he was national champion and then competed for the United States in the Worlds in the early 50s. Some of the ideas that he put into action were not original to him, but his MacCready speed ring was his design. And it basically mounted to a vario, and it gave you an indication of a suggested speed to fly based upon the thermal strength. Now, that's the way we think of it. But if you really go back and study what Paul was trying to do, back in those days, most contests were based on distance and speed. So the question is, if I want to get to my destination 1 minute faster, I change my MacCready setting by a value of 1. Now that's the way it was originally designed, and you have to think about some of the aircraft that it was what were flying at that time. They weren't very sophisticated. Some of the most sophisticated airplanes had L/Ds of 31, 32, 33 to 1. So, and they had a polar that dropped off pretty precipitously if you tried to get them going over about 65 miles an hour. So if you think in terms of 65 miles an hour and a sink rate of about 100 feet per minute, for every 100 feet you gain, you can go forward 1 minute for that altitude. And that's kind of what it started out. Now, that's not the way we use it. But a couple of things to think about before we go a little deeper. First of all, it has no knowledge of the wind. It's only talking about your motion through the air mass. It has no knowledge of, it doesn't account for terrain. It doesn't know how high you are above the ground. It doesn't know how high you are above the mountains. It doesn't know any of those things. It doesn't comprehend. It's not designed to take that into account whatsoever. Now, in modern usages, first of all, we have to have this idea in our mind of the true rate of climb, which is what I've talked about several times. If we know the true rate of climb, then we can set a fairly accurate number, if that's what we choose to do, and use it as a speed to fly. Now we're going to talk about advantages and disadvantages here, so don't get too worried about it. That's the first piece of information I need to have, is what am I actually achieving? Or I need to choose a number that I think represents a valid and safe, maybe conservative expectation of how I'm going to fly. So, for example, maybe the thermals today are being forecast to be 4.5 to 5 knots. my personal maximum MacCready would probably be 3, maybe 3.2 or 3.4, but it's not going to be anywhere close to 4.5 or 5, because my achievable rate of climb has nothing. Well, if I'm good today, maybe it gets close to those, but most of the time I'm not going to achieve that rate of climb. And I'm going to use a MacCready number relative to what I expect or hope to be able to achieve as a real rate of climb, time over altitude gained. Excuse me, altitude gained over time. Okay, the other question that we want to ask ourselves as we are considering MacCready and what it's going to do for us is, what am I trying to do? Am I trying to maximize my speed? Am I trying to maximize my time in the air? Am I trying to determine how much of a margin I might have in order to finish at a reasonable speed? These are the ways today that people use the MacCready value. And we're going to talk a little bit about what happens if I don't fly the right speed. And one of the important things to walk away from this is, if I say I'm going to be using a MacCready value of, let's say 3, like I said earlier, and a MacCready value of 3 says that I should be flying at 85 knots, what happens to my achieved cross-country speed? There's other things involved, but achieved cross-country speed if I fly 5 or even 10 knots slower, or 5 or 10 knots faster? And the answer is, it doesn't make a lot of difference in my achieved speed. And again, we're going to look at the derivation of that here in just a moment. So there's a number of techniques, or a number of ways that I can choose to set my MacCready value. One is called the height band approach. And that is, at lower altitude, I lower my MacCready number. Now, down here towards the bottom, I have a statement that says, don't lie to your flight computer. If you're using a digital device that's supposed to be computing and helping you make decisions, and you tell it that you want it to help you with a MacCready of 3, but you're flying a MacCready of 2, it's going to give you some indications that are perhaps going to give an indication that your performance is worse than it actually is, not better. So if you want to fly slower, pick a lower number. Don't fly slower and expect the computer to be giving you valid direction and decision details. One of the things about a lower MacCready value is it increases your range. And again, we're going to see that here in just a moment. And it reduces your altitude loss over time. Now, one of the articles that I'm going to attach with the email is one by John Cochran, which is called Flying MacCready with Uncertain Thermal Strength and Limited Altitude. And it's got some areas in the middle that are quite mathematical, but it has a lot of summary, which if you sit down and work your way carefully through the summary, you can begin to understand that slowing down as you go down makes a lot of sense, because it gives you the opportunity to find a thermal of a given strength. And so that kind of leads to the next question. What thermal am I willing to use right now? Now, this is set the MacCready for the thermal you're willing to use. So maybe when I'm up at cloud base, if I hit a 6-knot thermal, I might slow down, pull in a little bit of flap and S-turn through it, but the cost to center it is higher than what I'm going to gain. And we're going to look at a table here in just a second. And so stopping the circle is not worth anything. And just pulling up slightly and gaining a little speed or altitude and some speed is more important. As you get lower, and further away from cloud base, you're probably willing to stop for a weaker thermal. So it's a sliding scale. Now, this is also kind of like your height band. It's basically the same thing. But as I'm cruising along, let's suppose that the ceilings are 8,000 feet. I'm out in the Freda. The ceilings are 8,000, or the cloud bases are 8,000 feet. And I found some 4.5 knot thermals, and I've got my MacCready set at 3, and I'm cruising along. And I now get down to 6,500 feet. Well, that's around 4,000 feet above the ground. Maybe I need to slow down a little bit. So I'll change my MacCready back to 2.5, or maybe even 2, and I'll fly that speed. I will fly whatever speed the MacCready number or the speed command tells me for that MacCready number. Now, again, we're going to look at some polar data here in just a moment, and we're going to look at why that doesn't matter a lot in terms of actually getting somewhere. Don't stop until you find the thermal that you've got your current MacCready value set for, which is also to say, don't just fly in a straight line. You may have to deviate one side or the other because you see something that tells you that that's where your thermal is. Don't just blindly fly in a straight line. But if you're flying for a while and you haven't found that, lower the MacCready, fly a slower speed, and look for that thermal. And again, if you look at the article from John Cochrane, talks about probability of thermals of a given strength in a certain distance. And you get down maybe 1,000 feet over the ground, you're going to take a 1 knot thermal. So if that's what you think you're going to take when you get down there, maybe you need to set your MacCready at 1 knot at, say, 3,000 feet or 2,500 feet AGL. So the point is, it's a tool for you to use to try to accomplish what you're trying to do, whether it's going fast or staying in the air or a combination of the two. You may have seen a couple of articles recently on a term called changing gears. And basically, when you're high, fly fast. When you're low, try to stay in the air. And those are two different ways to use the MacCready. One, when I'm high and fast, I'm going to use a high number. And when I'm down low, I'm going to use a low number. And I'm going to, instead of trying to go as fast as I can, I'm going to try to stay in the air and find lift that allow me to continue my flight. The last thing is how much altitude to ensure, question mark, my final glide. When we do a final glide, it is not the same way that we use MacCready for interthermal. Those first two are really much more about interthermal. How fast am I going to fly to the next thermal? What kind of thermal do I expect to fly to, or next one I want to use? However, once we believe that we are very close to the altitude needed to return back to where we want to go, or to wherever we're headed, we can up the MacCready value. Now, what does that do for us? That indicates a speed probably much higher than we want to fly. But more importantly, it gives us an altitude we need to climb to if we wanted to fly that speed. We don't plan to fly that speed. What we plan to do is fly slower. So this is one time we're going to lie to our computer. We're going to say, I want to fly. Let's suppose it would be great to fly back at a MacCready of 5 or 6. How much altitude do I need to fly the MacCready speed back to my next point, whatever it's, whether I started or where I'm going? What speed, what altitude would I need to do that? And that's how much altitude I'll gain. And then I'll fly back at maybe only slightly faster than I've been flying interthermal. And as I do that, I can see that the altitude required to reach my destination is going to increase or decrease. If the altitude required increases, I'm dropping below my glide slope. If the altitude required decreases or the number gets larger about how high I'll be when I get there, then I'm above glide slope and I remain above glide slope. Now, in a competitive environment, you try to cut that margin perhaps a little thinner. But in a sport environment, you probably want to make sure that you have more than enough altitude to fly home, with the expectation that there is some possibility that you're going to hit some down air. Now, this comes back to lying to your computer. If you say a MacCready of 6, it says you're going to find lift, a MacCready of 6, and you're going to find sink compensatory, well, I can't say that right tonight, with a kind of sink that surrounds 6 air. And so it's trying to balance that out. It doesn't care about wind, it doesn't care about terrain, but it's going to show you values that may be less helpful. If you use a 6 to climb up to your altitude and then put it back on 4 because that's the speed you really want to fly, that's the safest way to do it. Now, one of the articles you're going to read about with John Cochran is never ever, never ever set your MacCready to 0, because it guarantees that you will not get home, because then your computer is lying to you. All right. Let's move on to the next one. So just a little faster speed, please. So what speed do we achieve using a particular MacCready with a particular, well, this is what we actually achieve in terms of speeds. So if we think that we've got a MacCready of 1, then the speed we need to fly, this is set up for an ASW 24. The speed we need to fly is 58. The L over D is 39. And our loss of feet per mile is 134. The average speed in miles an hour is only 27 miles an hour. So if we're flying 58 with an L over D of 39, we're going to get a average cross-country speed of 27 miles an hour. And you can read across all of these. So if I'm achieving 3, or if I'm expecting 3, 76, 30 to 1 feet lost per mile, you notice it doesn't really go up much. The average speed, however, jumps up quite a bit. And one of the things he says 3 is an everyday setting. Well, if you're really confident, he wants to go to a 4. I use 3.5 if I'm really confident. But the point is that you want to cruise faster than you might imagine if you're trying to cover ground, if you're trying to get somewhere. Because if you're flying too slow, your average thermal, if you're flying too slow in your interthermal, you're going to get a achieved speed fairly low. And if your intention is to get a good speed, you don't want to float around as if you're only going to get a 2. Now, let's go back. Let's go back and put this in perspective. What's the title of this article? Just a little faster, please. So it's an emphasis on speed. If you don't have an emphasis on speed, if all you want to do is just enjoy the day, you're going to use a 2. You're never going to go to a 3, because you just want to stay in the air and make sure that you can have some good flying. You might set it to 3 to climb up to do your final glide, but just hanging around the area, doing a close-in triangle, 2 is probably just fine. Okay, so glide ratio versus speed. Again, this is another article which is attached to the email, already attached. I just have to mail it to you when I get the video link. So this is a climb rate of 1, 2, 3, 4 knots. And the way we can figure things out is we take the climb rate and we draw a line from it until it tangents the polar. And that is the speed to fly. And this line graphically represents the glide angle. Notice that if I fly 5 knots slower, the glide angle doesn't change that much. Even if I fly 5 knots faster, the glide angle, they're about the same. So going faster or a little bit slower isn't going to change the glide angle. But it does change the amount of altitude you're going to lose. Because what we want to look at here, where's my marker here? Whoops. There we go. If we look here at the rate of sink, a line from here to here, and another line from here to here, come on, you can see that the vertical speed is changing. So if what I'm trying to do is minimize my loss of altitude and cover more range without much change in my L over D, then flying a little bit slower isn't going to hurt me. It's going to give me an opportunity to find more range. But I don't want to be flying way back here, because that, if we draw the line from here through the best L over D number, our speed, our achieved cross-country speed is going to be back here. Now this is based on standard MacCready, which is to say we climb at a certain rate and then we use the altitude up at approximately the same rate. So if I'm climbing at 3 knots, I'm cruising at 3 knots. And that 3 knots down. And that is the standard sawtooth pattern, which is what this was designed for. Today, we don't often do the sawtooth pattern. And as I mentioned, if you can find that lift line, you extend that glide out quite a ways, you can make much better speed than what this diagram would give you. Okay, trying to wrap this up a little bit. We're all already coming up later than I hoped. So flying slower will reduce your loss of altitude. Flying faster doesn't cost much in range. In other words, flying faster means I'll get to this point out here with about the same range, but I'm going to lose the altitude to get there. Well, we expect that. And varying your speed has a minimal effect on your achieved cross-country speed. But then my comment, which I've made several times, if you can avoid climbing at all, that will improve your speed. And I suggest you go out on the internet, find some of these people like Jim Payne or Mitch Poling, who do these fantastic flights. And you'll see they go for miles without bothering to circle. And some of that is how they choose the line that they're going to fly, the lift line. But circling and gliding is not the way to get the highest speed, but it is a good way to get started. Okay, any questions before I move on to the last couple of things? Okay, there you go, Vitek, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. It would be useful to talk about next time what to do when you're 50 miles out on your final glide, the decision-making process that you're going at that point.
Okay, well, actually, we're going to talk about what I was going to talk about next week, and maybe that'll help. Yeah, I'll look at trying to put some of that in next time.
Great.
Now you're the one that makes all the long flights, Vitek. I maybe ought to have you give that presentation.
Maybe.
Okay. Now, let's try to put some of this into perspective. And actually, as we get closer to the flying season, what do you want to do? How are you going to get ready, or how are you going to improve your cross country? The rule is, or the stated goal is, better climbing is faster speeds, and avoiding climbing is even better. But let's start with the climbing better. And part of these things, this first one is actually something that George Moffat recommends in his Winning on the Wind. Maybe it's not the best day to go cross country, but it might be a really good day to practice thermal centering. So you get up, you launch, you go out, you find a thermal, blunder into it or make a good choice, and you climb up. Let's say you climb up a few hundreds of feet, or maybe 1,000 feet. So you have yourself a nice buffer. Run away from the thermal, maybe a half mile, fly away for a minute, come back in and practice recentering it. You basically know where it is, or you should have an idea where it is, but practice recentering, fly away, come back. If the ceilings are only 2,500 feet or 3,000 feet, you can still climb 500, run away, come back and climb 500, and just keep doing that, developing a better skill at tightening it up, or I should say centering it up and moving the thermal around. One of the things I've talked about a couple of different times is mapping the thermal in your mind. Now, I have to admit, I have found that fairly easy to do. And that might just be a simple characteristic of the way my mind works. But oftentimes I have flown with people and in two-place gliders, and we'll be making a turn, and I'll say, well, where do you think the center of the thermal is? And that kind of go, well, I'm not certain. I say, well, it's just right behind your right wing. Make a little tighter turn and let's go over there. I cannot give you a detailed process of how I do that, unfortunately. But part of it is making round circles, maintaining positional awareness. Where am I relative to where I last felt that thermal? And it's a skill you can develop, I'm sure, because I've seen people I've worked with develop it, but it doesn't necessarily come easy. The next thing to practice is a straight glide. And there's a couple of different aspects to this. One of the things that I've seen happen looking at IGC files is that someone starts off on a heading and they run into a thermal, or maybe they get a little sink on one wing and their heading changes. And then it changes again. And every time you're not flying a straight line, if you need to, you're wasting altitude. So part of the thing about going cross country is to use your altitude wisely. And that means use it precisely. Fly a straight line towards where you think you are going to find the next thermal, or for what this next practice is. Pick a point, might be the base of a thermal. Estimate the distance. This is important because while we can have a point on our flight computer that tells us, I mean, if I'm going back to my home glider port, my flight computer and GPS tells me exactly how far it is. But if I want to go to that thermal or that cloud over there, I need to have a pretty good guess about how far away I think it is, because then I can make a guess at how much time, and then I can make a guess of if I've been paying attention to that cloud, is it still going to be active when I get there? I mean, if I have found, and I'm sure that each of you can say, well, I went to the cloud, but nothing was happening when I got there. Well, it took too long to get there. And it may have taken too much altitude, and you may have found yourself in in a different situation. And one of the things that VTech brought up today is in-flight decision-making. If you're going to fly and you've got thermal markers in particular, you should have an A, B, and C cloud. If I think A is going to be working when I get there, but if I get there and it's not, B is over here, and hopefully B isn't behind me, because if I'm not going forward, going backward is going to be really bad. So as you study the sky, you need to be thinking about not just what thermal I might use in front of me, but one on either side that looks like it might be working. Again, back to the straight line. Many times I've seen people go like this towards a cloud and then change their mind and say, oh, this one might be better. Oh no, this one might be better. And they end up wandering all over the sky. Now, there was a question that one of you sent me regarding how do I break the apron strings? How do I leave the vicinity of my airfield? Well, the first thing is you've got to fly to where the lift is with accuracy and precision. And you've got to have a pretty good idea where that's going to be. And so that hails back to the discussion we had 3 weeks ago on hunting the wild thermal. If there's a convective layer out there, there's lift out there, you should be able to have a pretty good idea, either looking at something on the ground or looking at the cloud and say, that's where I think the potential for me to maintain or gain altitude is going to be. The wandering is wasteful. I also find that people get a little frantic. I have a couple people that I've worked with that have a flight computer, and the flight computer says, I'm 200 feet above final glide at my whatever MacCready value I want. I'm 200 feet above final glide. I will arrive at my destination 200 feet above traffic pattern altitude. And they say, got to turn around. But if they only looked ahead a quarter of a mile, there's a very strong indication of a very strong thermal. It's going to cost you that 200 feet to go there. When you get there, climb up, and now you're 7, 8, 10, 1,000, 1,500 feet above your final glide, and you can keep moving forward. Learn to look not behind you or back, but look in front of you to where the energy is. Develop the skill to look ahead and say, if I only go another half mile, I will find the lift. And conversely, say, how did I get here? Well, there were 3 thermals behind me as I was going out here. The likelihood is that when I turn around and go back, those energy sources are still going to be there. So maybe I'm 100 feet or 200 feet below final glide. Turn around and go back. Maybe go back at a slightly slower speed. So just be thinking about that. Okay, so straight glide practice. Pick a point, estimate the distance, choose a speed to fly. Hold that speed, estimate the altitude and the time to go to that point, and evaluate how you did and try again. What's it cost in time and altitude to get to a point that you think is going to give you more lift? This is what this is all about. Homework. I'm sending a bunch of articles to you. I don't expect you necessarily to drudge through all the mathematics, but there's a lot of good information, a lot more detail for many of the topics we talked about today. And work your way through the detail, take your time, because there's so much to be gained from understanding what's there. My plan was to talk about flight computers next week. And in particular, I'm going to send you a little worksheet. And among other things, the worksheet is going to ask you some of these questions and a few more besides. What do I want to know? Now, when I talk to people, the first thing they said is, I want to know how far it is back to the airport. And that's true. Most people want to know that pretty quickly. But what else do you want to know? When do I need to know it? The reason that is some of these flight computers switch modes, and they're in a cruise mode or they're in a climb mode. And what do I need to know when I'm climbing? What do I want to know when I'm cruising? Those are the kinds of things that you need to think about in order to be using these flight computers. And the real question is, how is it going to change my flying decisions? Now, the reason I bring this up is it's possible to have too much information. If you don't know what you want to do with that information, if you don't think it's giving you anything to help you change your flying decisions, you don't need that piece of information. That information is distracting. So less is more oftentimes in this case. I'm going to give you a list of info boxes. Most of the different software flight computers have this concept of an info box. It's a box on the screen where you can say, I want this kind of information to show up there. But if you don't know what's possible, it's very hard to choose one. And one of the ways to look at them is, for example, I've already mentioned to you that one of the info boxes I like is percentage of time circling. You know, how much of my time have I been not going forward? And I like to try to reduce that number. Now, at some point, I may no longer want to have that number, but for right now, it's useful to me. So I'm going to give you a list of the info boxes. I know that most of the books that are manuals that I've read are not always crystal clear as to what that piece of data actually means. But at the point where you are just starting to use a flight computer or something like an UDI or a Nano 4 or one of those devices, you don't need a bunch of information, but a couple of pieces would be nice. And so I'm going to try to give you a list of possible pieces of data that you may or may not want to see on one of your screens. And it's a fact that some of the flight computers offer different info boxes. So I'm going to try to send you about 3 different lists, at least 3 different lists, and maybe 4 of the kind of data that is available in a flight computer, whether it be an UDI or a Nano 4 or an XC SOAR device. Let's see, UDI is CU Mobile. XC SOAR is its own Android device of some kind running XC SOAR. Let's see, UDI, XC SOAR. What was the third one I said? The Nano from LX Navigation, which has a lot of the same information that you might get on a 9000. And then the last one is probably going to be ClearNav, if I can find the list. It's a little harder to get that list. Okay. Comments?
Mike, I just have a quick note. You brought up Nano 4, an LX product.
Mm-hmm.
Just a heads up on that. I made the mistake of actually ordering one of those and trying to use it as a primary machine in a glider. And I came to find out that if you're flying an OLC flight, there's no way to show your breadcrumb trail long enough to come back and close your triangle. It was a pretty nice machine other than that, but I could not do that. The breadcrumb trail was only maybe 10 or 15 minutes long, and that was it. You couldn't stretch it out.
Well,
so I sent it back.
Well, the point is you can, if you know where you were, it's not that hard to get within 1 mile of it, which is what you have to do. I mean, if you knew where you flew, oftentimes it's close to where you had a release or somewhere up a ridge line or something like that. But you're right, it doesn't give you that long a bread trail. None of them do. What have you tried instead of it?
I'm not sure what you mean by none of them do, because I have an old GPS I bought for my sailboat 20 years ago, and it gives me a trail the whole trip, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. And I've also used XC-SOAR, and it gives me as much as I want. You can make a complete trail of the whole multi-hour trip, so it's easy to come back and see where you were at any
Okay.
given point.
Well,
So
I
I was
guess
surprised when the Nano 4 did not have that. I was really surprised.
Yeah. XC-SOAR, if you put that long a trail on, it will give you a trail that long, which can sometimes be, yeah. I don't normally keep my trails as long as my flight. So if you're going to try to do OLC and close them up, you need to keep aware of where you can possibly cross your own track. But on a secondary issue with regard to the Nano 4 or even the UDI, and that is that both of them are very good navigation tools, and both of them give you the ability to put a lot of information out there in your display. So just a point. Now, I've used XC-SOAR for pretty close to 15 years now, so I'm very, very, very familiar with it. I fly with an instrument called an Open Vario flight computer, which is running XC-SOAR in my Mini. I've flown with an UDI before. I fly with a Nano 4 as my backup instrument for navigation and also for an audio vario, although it's uncompensated. It's very useful if I lost everything else. And my new glider has a ClearNav 2 in it. And so I'm going through another learning curve to figure out how to get this new flight computer to answer my soaring decision questions. Okay, anything else? Well, you guys have yourself a good weekend, and we'll get back together next week, I guess.
I'll be here next week. So thank you, Mike, and appreciate all the information you're giving out and really enjoying this.
Well, thank you very much, Keith. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Have a good day.
Yep.
Thanks, Mike. We're out of here.
Take
Thank you,
care.
Mike.
Mike, thanks.
Mark.
It's very exciting. And I think that this portion of the presentation is far more important than all the other technical stuff that we're having to absorb and perhaps remember in flight. So maybe you can expand this section in some other presentation. And have a nice new.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Mike.
Yep.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep. You guys have a good week.